Hello and welcome to Sales Gambit. I'm your host Ashish, CEO of Convin, a conversation intelligence platform for the sales teams. In today's episode of Sales Gambit, we have Christion Embury, the account executive at a sales growth company. Christion has been talking about gap selling for good time, and he believes in helping sales team by making them understand the gap. The gap that we're talking about is the gap where the customer is today and where they want to be tomorrow. And that's exactly what we'll be talking about in proper detail in this episode of Sales Gambit. Welcome to Sales Gambit, Christion. Really happy to have you today.
Thank you. Happy to be here, Ashish.
I have briefly introduced you to the audience, right? But I'd love to hear from you. How did you get into sales? It seems like you have recently joined sales, but you have been very active on the social media, gaining a lot of, encouragement from everyone. So how has it been?
Yeah, I guess it's been a wild ride, right? I am quite new to the sales world professionally still, but it's one of those things where it's just been a part of my life since I was little, right? I was the kid out in the driveway with the sign for the car wash and stop and get your car washed for $5. I made paper ninja stars in middle school and sold them for $1 a piece, which was all fun and games until one of my friends hit my principal in the head with one in the hallway and I had to return all the profits. So it's one of those things that at a young age, I always had that entrepreneurial spirit. And I knew I wanted to talk to people and engage and connect and really solve problems. And so, when I came across gap selling, it was just kind of a natural progression. I knew immediately that this was the way the world was going, and I wanted to be a part of that change.
Very interesting. And so you joined this. Is this your first company, or have you worked before this as well somewhere else?
Yeah, I had a couple internships in college, was in an inside sales role at one point, went through a massive corporations B2B sales development program, got some good exposure to a varying amount of industries. But I knew I had gone through Sandler when I was in inside sales at a software company. And I just knew that there was more to selling than what it had been made out to be, and all the stereotypes and all the ways that it's been portrayed in the media over the years. So that's kind of what I wanted to do.
Very interesting. So, when we dive into this topic, which is about gap selling today, right? Basics of gap selling, and we'll go, deeper into it as well. From my perspective, when it comes to selling, it's mostly about the questions you ask and the answers you get, and how do you understand what is the need of a prospect, right? What is the pain point that they are facing, and then figuring out where do they want to be, and how do they want to solve those problems, all those things. How do you go ahead with defining gap selling in the easiest way possible for someone like me, right, who doesn't know a lot about gap selling?
Well, I think in its most simplistic form, it's what you described earlier, right? It's having a full understanding of where somebody in their organization is today and where they want to be tomorrow, and understanding how you fit into the picture to help them go from their current state to their future state. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is change. And we know change is not easy. Humans are naturally change adverse, but we have to understand that as sellers. And we have to understand whether or not the change is worth it. And the only way to do that, like you said, is by asking good questions and understanding the full picture. So, yeah.
Interesting. So, for example, if how do you start this conversation? If you can take an example, let's say, from your own experience, that when you go to a prospect, how do you start that conversation to identify where they are today and where do they want to reach tomorrow? That'd be great.
Absolutely. So there's really two main approaches as I see it, and it's going to depend on the lead source. If it's inbound, if it's outbound, the linguistics are going to change slightly, but at the end of the day, my number one goal in every discovery call is to figure out why the hell they're talking to me in the first place. So if it's inbound, I want to understand what prompted them to reach out, and that's usually my first question. Like, hey, appreciate you reaching out, understand in your note that you mentioned X, Y, and Z is going on. Today, I just want to get a better understanding of what's prompting you to reach out in the first place. versus if it's outbound, I usually have some sort of an idea of the problem that they may be experiencing. And that's how I set up the premise of the call to dive deeper into that. And then I just kind of go from there. It's a similar, like, can you help me understand what prompted you to take this call today? Something along those lines.
Easier said than done, Christian, right? And I'm sure you'd agree, right? So, for example, when you start delving deeper into those questions about where are they today, and then try to understand where do they want to be in future, it's not as simple as it sounds, right? They might not give you the real answer immediately in just one question, right? So, is there a proper way of around the questions you ask, the way you control the conversation, which leads them to reveal all these things for you?
I think yes and no. There's not a silver bullet to anything, right? The most important thing to having them be truthful with you and forthcoming with information, you gotta listen. You can't just go a completely different route if they give you an opening. Most of the time they're expecting you to take it, or they might not have even realized that they gave it to you. But if you just end up in a complete non sequitur that has nothing to do with what they just said, you're going to upset them and they're going to be more cagey. The other thing is really fundamentally understanding what problems your product or service solves and understanding how they relate to each business, because each business has a very different set of these problems. They manifest in a very different way. But as a whole, ultimately, you're only solving 3 to 5 business problems with the product or service. So if you understand what the most common root causes or technical problems are that are creating the business problems, it's much easier to be nimble in the conversation and navigate when you hear a technical problem or a root cause. You know that that's usually resulting in X, Y, or Z. And having that information, being armed with that going into a discovery call and prospecting and marketing, all of these things, it's fundamentally what gives you that understanding of your buyer.
Fair point, and I think I agree with that. So from your experience, can you help us understand how is gap selling different? And I mean, why does it really work in first place? Probably, that would be great.
Absolutely. I think the biggest distinction between gap selling and every other sales methodology out there, we don't sell to need. We don't sell a product. We don't sell features or benefits or what we can do for the customer. We first and foremost root out in the early conversations whether or not there is a reason to change. And I think a good example is kind of along the lines I was just mentioning. There's nothing out there that differentiates between a technical problem and a business problem. And we've been taught to sell to pain for God knows how long, but pain is essentially what the technical problem is in a lot of cases. It's an outdated system or process, an inefficient workflow, etc. But it's not a true reason for change. So what, your system is inefficient and you have to spend all these extra hours on it. What does that actually mean to the business? And that, I think, is our key differentiator in the marketplace, is drilling into the fundamental understanding of your buyer's world and getting reps to not just pitch as soon as they hear somebody say, oh, we don't like our process for this. We can help you with that. The phrase happy ears is a common one, right? They get happy ears when they hear a pain, and they fail to take a step back and truly understand what that means for their business. So in comparison to all the other methodologies out there, I mean, I've done a ton of research. It's kind of part of the job, right? When you're in competitive situations. So I think that's the biggest differentiator.
So basically you're saying that rather than just focusing on the pain, try to focus on the impact that you really want, them to experience, right? And how you can change their life, and it might be business, it might be something else, and then you help with that. Is that the correct understanding? Am I getting it right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I think the only thing I'd add is, I don't know if there's any other hypochondriacs out there who go on WebMD, right? Once they feel a little tiny thing is wrong with them. But when you type in some of your symptoms into WebMD, you get all these scary options ranging from, oh, it's just a virus, to, oh, you might have cancer, you should go see a doctor.
Yeah.
That is self-diagnostic in its truest form. And when you go into the doctor, do they just accept your diagnostic at face value. No, they ask you a lot of questions. They're the experts who have spent years of their life dedicated to understanding what these symptoms mean and the potential manifestations of them in a patient. And if you look at sales in the same way, you should be the expert in your field and in your industry and in what you sell, but not only the product, the problems it solves. If you don't understand the problems it solves, you're going to be accepting at face value the buyer's self-diagnosis. And that's why we see things like churn related to sales not selling the right way. That's why we see things like buyers going dark and losing to the status quo. It's because fundamentally, salespeople don't do a good enough job in discovery to understand why they should change and what all of the symptoms actually manifest into in the business.
Christion, this is very interesting, right? And I think I would love to understand properly, right, for me and for my audiences as well. Is it possible for you to give us an example of a scenario, trying to explain it with one sales methodology and then trying to have it from the gap methodology to see what the difference exactly can be? And we can build up a very hypothetical scenario about a software does, let's say, X or something like that. Is it possible?
I guess, could you give me a scenario, like a sales methodology?
Yeah. So let's say, we want to sort of go about selling an employment engagement software, right? And if you had to do that, if you had to sort of discover about employment engagement for me as a company, how do you go about a general methodology versus how Gap would really improve it? Yeah, for me, that would be great.
So I'll speak to the gap selling side. I don't know how everybody else would do it, but if you tell me you sell an employee engagement software, that to me signals right away, okay, the problems that are most likely occurring due to a lack of employee engagement, because that is a technical cause, right? It could be things like high voluntary turnover. It could be things like high or lower profitability, rather, because you're having to pay to not only replace and recruit in this marketplace, but also the time to get somebody back to full productivity. And the impact is going to vary based upon what type of department is seeing the most employee churn in. It could be things like a salesperson who they've had like 20% voluntary turnover over the last year. That's a much bigger red flag than something like shipping and logistics, unless shipping and logistics, because they don't have enough employees in place, they've been missing like their deliveries, or they're not able to get things out on time, whatever the case may be, is going to vary. But I know for a fact, if my employees are not engaged, I'm not going to buy because of that. Meanwhile, if I'm losing X% dollars, if I'm behind on developing products because I can't retain my product employees or my sales employees, and so revenues, there's all these different factors that are the true reasoning to buy. Whereas employee engagement may be what the traditional sales methodology sells on, but it's not the thing that's going to ultimately give you as a salesperson influence over the deal.
Interesting. And if I have to ask you, right, is gap selling for everyone? Do you think anyone in the world, across any company, any firm, anything, selling any other thing, right, could use gap selling, or is it for very defined set of companies that it should work for?
I would say we're industry agnostic. We sell to software, we sell to med device, we sell to manufacturing. The only area that we don't necessarily play well in is an RFP environment where you have no ability to influence the criteria upon which the decision is being made. Outside of that, I think the core principles are based in psychology. They're based in why people do the things that they do. And gap selling helps you as a seller understand that, but also be able to execute on it and get to the individual's intrinsic motivation for change. So I don't see that conflicting with any particular industry or any cultural differences that I'm aware of. At least at the end of the day, it's truly about serving and helping your buyer make the right decision for their business.
Makes sense. Would you be able to come up with certain, real life examples that have happened in your own experience, probably with you or your colleagues, right? Where using gap selling really turned around the deal, right? Probably if you can give me an example around it, that would be great for the audiences.
Absolutely. I think I made a post about this one when I was explaining the concept of I'm confused, right? But essentially, I'd been chatting with this client. This was back when I first started as an AE in November, and we had the discovery. Everything was going great. I thought we had them. I knew why they should buy. The gap was multi-millions, and I was confused because I hadn't heard back from him in like 2 weeks. We were supposed to hear back from legal on the contract, whether or not it was okay to send for signature, and he's starting to go dark. In the email that I wrote, I essentially laid out how I saw the situation. And I forget the exact figures, I'd have to go and check, but it was, like I said, multi-millions of dollars that were being left on the table and lost. And we weren't even considering things like customer retention rate and their CLV. So it was a lot deeper of a problem than we knew. In traditional selling, if I would have just accepted what he first told me when I asked him, why did he reach out? He told me, I want to train my team with Keenan. I want us to be gap sellers. If I wouldn't have understood the why, I wouldn't have been able to influence the deal. So that is ultimately, it's not to manipulate. It's not to try and just close every single deal you can. It's to focus on the ones where you can actually help, to focus on the ones where you can have an impact. Those are the people that are going to buy. And when you're using it the right way, people love it. Like they do. We were working with this one company, and I sat in, we do some call coaching sessions sometimes with their team. And I sat in on it last week or 2 weeks ago, I don't remember, but moot point. At one point, the buyer literally said, "Are you recording this using Gong?" And the rep was like, "Yeah." And the buyer said, "Can you send this to me afterwards? I want to share it with my sales team. You just hit all of my KPIs and I want them to get like that." And this was maybe a month after we trained them. That in and of itself is one of the many reasons that I believe it's the truth. People want to be sold this way because they don't want to be sold. And that's at the end of the day what gap selling is about.
Fair point. A very specific question here, Christion, right? Probably a lot of people can answer you about the question on where is the current state they are in, right? What is the current state they are at? And they can tell you their problems and everything, and you can actually figure out what is the current state that they have, right? But not everyone can articulate about their future state properly, right? It's not that buyers know everything upfront that they need to know, or they can envision everything upfront, right? How do you handle such cases? How do you navigate them to the right path during the conversation of discovery in those specific cases?
It's a good question. And it's not an easy thing to do, but I think fundamentally, salespeople traditionally have been so obsessed with the future state that that's the first place that they go to. Well, oh, what if we could do this for you? What if we could do that for you? Wouldn't that be great? Yada, yada, yada. And that isn't as powerful as taking a second to really ask the right questions and get a full understanding of their current state before moving on to, okay, so if we take this away, what do you think that would look like? At some points, it is stepping into the unknown. It's not for certain. You cannot commit to a specific number. But if the current state is so bad that they literally are losing millions and millions of dollars or whatever the case may be, you have to do something to act. You have to show them the cost of inaction. And if you can't understand what that means for their business, you can't influence the deal again.
Does emotion have a role to play here while you are trying to make the transition between current state to future state? Do you sort of evoke the emotion of the prospects while on the call?
Absolutely. And there are a lot of ways to do that, but all sales have emotion to it. When we really think about what we're asking a buyer to do, when we're asking them to sign our contract, we're asking them to not only spend money, but spend time and risk their personal brand within the own organization to make this change. You as a buyer, or you as a seller rather, have to be conscious of that going in, and you have to have a damn good reason as to why they should risk all that to go with you. And I think it's as simple as sometimes, like if I hear somebody say, oh, our win rates are at 7%, I will drop my jaw on the Zoom like that and evoke some sort of personal reaction or attempt to from them. All the time people are like, oh yeah, I know, right? Or you can say, that seems frustrating. I'd be pissed off if I was you. That's low. There's a lot of ways to do it, and it's not meant to manipulate. It's more so to be empathetic.
Makes sense. All of this really tells me that gap selling is not easy, right? I mean, it might sound very easy to do. It's hard, right? But is it worth the reward? And if yes, can you point out a couple of the benefits that you have observed, while doing the gap selling or executing the gap selling? What are the benefits that you have observed in terms of sales cycles, business outputs, all of that?
Absolutely. Yeah. For me personally, or for
for you personally, or what you have observed for others as well, that would be great.
Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, it's a shift. It's a mindset shift. So there's a part of that comes into play. It's helped me in my personal life in a lot of ways, but speaking specifically to like the actual business side, right? I'm an AE. I have a number to hit, and this helps me hit it. I sell it while selling it. And so, for example, I started in November. I have a 65% win rate at an average sale price of about 60K, and it's about a 35-day sales cycle for me, which is in my book pretty good, especially if you look at industry averages. So that's not me bragging. That's not me trying to say, look at me, but it works. And that's why I believe in it so strongly, is because I've had success with it. I've seen other people have success with it. And yes, it's really hard. It's the concept of mastery, right? But if what you're doing is easy every day, if you're never challenged and there's no way that you can get better, I mean, that's not the life I want to live.
Fair point. Have you seen decrease in shorter sales cycles or probably selling price? Do you sort of attribute these outputs as well to a better executed gap selling?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The main problems we solve are long sales cycles, a low average sale price, low conversion rates, weak pipeline generation, and just a decline in overall revenue or quota attainment. We help teams fix that. It comes in a very varying amount of ways, right? But at the end of the day, the reason that it affects all those things is because of the information that you're trying to get. We talk about this concept of being a sales influencer over an order taker. And that's not like, oh, look at my social media following type of influencer. It's a type where you can actually control to some degree how the sale is going to go. And you can only do that by doing that next level discovery.
Interesting. While I totally align with this, Christion, are there, can you point out a couple of skills that probably anyone will have to work on before they want to get into gap selling? And I'm pretty much sure that they would really have to learn, right? When they're in the aware state, rather than just going into gap selling all the way in, right? So what are the couple of things that you would suggest people should learn about and then get into gap selling?
Number one is going to be curiosity. You cannot gap sell if you don't have an innate curiosity about somebody's business and you truly want to understand. Again, it's coming back to the whole mindset shift. We're trying to understand before we try to reply or respond. Number two would be active listening. Without that, good luck. Good luck trying to gap sell if you cannot listen and try and actually hear what the other person is saying. If I had to think of a third, it'd probably be a bit of a fearlessness. It can be uncomfortable at first when you're starting to have these business level conversations, because it's not what you're used to. Most sellers are used to staying in the technical weeds about the product and the features and benefits. You have to be fearless and not afraid to ask questions. It kind of plays into the curiosity. So, I mean, fourth, business acumen, hands down. If you don't have business acumen, go look up what it is and then study the shit out of everything you can in your industry. That'll go miles in conversations.
Fair point. Do you think empathy plays an important role here in terms of, you understanding the emotional state of the buyer and then trying to sort of, navigate from the current state to the future state?
Absolutely. It kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier, right? You're asking so much of your buyer to make this change. If you can't relate to them, if you can't understand what that must be like, you're not going to get the information you need. And you need to understand why they need to change before you can really have that empathy.
Makes sense. Let's say that we agree to the fact that gap selling can be very rewarding, right? Do you suggest a way to is there a way to sort of introducing gap selling to your sales team? Should it be done in a specific way by sales managers or leaders for their teams?
Yeah, hit me up on LinkedIn and we can chat. No, it's one of those things where we talk to a lot of companies who have started by having a book club internally with their team, and then meeting weekly to discuss key takeaways from a chapter and how they're going to go out and implement it in their day-to-day. And that seems to be, for a lot of people, a good way to start to introduce it to the organization. Additionally, you can follow Keenan on LinkedIn. He puts out a ton of great content on how to do that. I've started in the last few months here to put out some actionable tips that you can actually go and implement. We have an online training system. So there's a bunch of ways that we can help others on that journey. But I think fundamentally it comes down to, do you need to change and why? And that should influence how you approach the rollout or the introduction of gap selling, but also any sales methodology or even tool.
Is it equally scalable like other sales methodologies? What did you say? Or is it hard to sort of get teams adapt to it, given now that we are in a COVID stuck situation, working from homes and all that?
Could you define scalable?
For example, scaling it across multiple teams and multiple representatives across multiple different parts of the world, right? They're not at a singular place, right? So if I have to implement Band or something else, right, it might be easier for me. Do you think gap selling is in a similar way easy to implement and scale across these representatives?
Yeah, I mean, not as easy as BANT, right? Because that's just a 4-letter acronym. I hope nobody listening is using BANT still. Please hit me up if you are, and I'll explain why that's bad. But at the end of the day, the way we roll out our training is going to depend on the team, the problems they're experiencing, and how quickly we need to move. Last year, probably 50% to 55% of our revenue came from countries that were not the United States. We roll this out globally to teams in Australia, in Europe, in Brazil. There's a lot of teams around the globe that are starting to pick this up, and they're dispersed teams. So it's not necessarily one region specific. It's not necessarily we can't do this, but we structure it in a way that makes the most sense for an organization. Like, we don't have a training session with more than 30 people because we know that we're going to lose some of the engagement and the retention of the key concepts if we go over that threshold. So if we have to do multiple sessions for a bigger team, great, let's do it. But let's do it right.
Understood. Makes sense. And do you have any reading recommendation at last to sort of help people, start looking into what gap selling can be and how they can really implement it?
I mean, obviously gap selling, right? I think one of my personal favorites would probably be the Challenger sale too. Understanding the mindset behind what makes a good salesperson and what doesn't. Challenger is a competitor, but we actually love them. They do a lot of great work, and they kind of, they're our favorite of the competitors. Let's just leave it at that. Along with that, I like Never Split the Difference. I like Atomic Habits. There's a lot of books out there. I think it also kind of depends on your goal, right? If you're implementing gap selling, read some books on psychology, do some consumer behavior study, because we're all, at the end of the day, consumers, right? If you're selling B2B versus B2C, you're still selling to a human. So get to understand what makes people tick.
Makes sense. No, fantastic. I think this is really actionable in that sense that just not looking at the books that talk about gap selling directly, you also need to work on your indirect skills around understanding psychology of the people who you're talking to, basically. Makes sense, Christian. That brings me to the end of this podcast. It was such an insightful session and I learned a lot. I am sure the audience will love this podcast when this comes out. Thank you again for coming on Sales Gambit.